Well, thank you for this warm, wet welcome. If any of you wondered why I wasn't sitting patiently in a seat, it's because my backside is soaked from walking over in the rain. But that's the way life is. So I've been asked to speak this evening about some things we've learned about science through its history. Now that could go on for days and days and days. So I've been fairly selective, and if you have questions at the end, I'll be more than happy to try to answer them. I want to thank David Rudge for making this possible, to the University Center for the Humanities and the Mallinson Institute for Science Education for bringing me here. Now, let me start out with what may be a radical claim, especially for those in science education. There was no science as we know it before 1800. That's right. Historically, there was no entity as we know it called science before roughly 1800, the late 18th century, early 19th century. It took historians of science a long time to discover this, because the original historians of science, about the time they started being worked on about World War I, just assumed that if they studied the same thing scientists discovered in the early 20th century, they could just take those categories safely back to antiquity. Well, scholarship in the last few decades has shown that sort of essentialism, that science then is science now, really tends to distort our understanding of the past. If you focus on the more neutral term of students of nature, in early antiquity and fairly a little beyond that, they were typically called philosophers. Philosophers were people who tried to learn about the world around them. The term science, until about the early 19th century, was a broad, sweeping synonym for knowledge. And for much of this period, between the early Middle Ages and the 19th century, theology of all fields was considered the queen of the sciences. Nobody would say that. You don't have theologians here, do you? Divinity school? No. And in Latin was known as scientia. Now, students of nature over the centuries started specializing a little bit, and by the end of antiquity, you had groups that would refer to themselves as natural philosophers. Natural philosophers wanted to discover how the world works. So in many schemes, even physiology was considered part of natural philosophy. Then you had natural history, which was like taking an inventory of the earth. Geology, botany, mineralogy, etc. And physicians who studied conditions of sickness and health and anatomy and things of that nature. There were no scientists. There were no scientists until the mid-19th century. The term was not even known before, had not been coined. Excuse me. Wonder if I'm coming down with a cold or something. And there was nothing known as the scientific method, which only appeared in the second half of the 19th century. People talked about the best ways of doing science and various methods, but there was no slogan called the scientific method, about which nobody knows anything. Now, science, as I say, emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century as students of nature, primarily the natural philosophers and natural historians, tried to capture that term for the study of nature alone, which eliminated the theologians and the other possessors of esoteric knowledge. You can imagine that some of the clerics and theologians fought back over this attempted coup, especially when it became very successful. And they said, you're demoting us to second-class citizens. You're not accrediting us as genuine scientists, which we've been for millennia. So there was some pushback from the religious community at that time. One of the things you don't see that helps to justify this birth of science, you don't see any titles in English, that's all I know, that have science and religion in them. Though religion, like science, has a history. Religion didn't exist as an intellectual category until about the 18th and 19th centuries. And in the early 19th century, you have the invention of a whole host of religions, usually by Western scholars, labeling certain Eastern practices and beliefs as these are a religion. The first book in English that I've found that has science and religion in the title appeared in 1823. After that, you start seeing scores and then hundreds and then thousands of books and articles dealing with this new topic of science and religion. You might wonder, why weren't there books before? There were certainly books devoted to faith and reason, but not to science and religion, because religion had not been separated from science. Probably the greatest natural philosopher in the history of the world, Isaac Newton, published in the late 17th, early 18th century, and he incorporated God as a scientific explanation, if you want to use that term, scientific. And in the second edition of his Principia, actually added a passage on natural philosophy as it relates to God. You couldn't be any more important or visible than Isaac Newton was during his lifetime. His scheme for the solar system, applying gravitation to it, led to a collapse of the solar system after a long time because of some irregularities. Newton, who wasn't particularly orthodox, but he was a theist, said, well, every now and then God steps in or reaches in to correct these problems, to keep the solar system from collapsing. Now, the single most distinguishing characteristic of science as it appeared in the 19th century was its reliance exclusively on what these days is called methodological naturalism. Now, students of nature going back to antiquity, some students of nature going back to antiquity, had tried to reduce the appeal to miracles. You know, that certain diseases were miraculous, or storms, or eclipses, or anything like that. And this picked up steam, although it was still acceptable for Isaac Newton when he was in a pinch to interject God to get him over a hump. By the early 19th century, students of nature, men of science as they were typically called in that time period, and just about every one of them, with a few exceptions, was a man, insisted that in order for a work to be considered scientific, in order for it to qualify as science, it must assign no work to God or the devil. I think some people today in the fundamentalist community still assign work to the devil in their publications, as surprising as it may seem. So what we have in the middle decades, and certainly late decades of the 19th century, is the disappearance of God talk from scientific literature. Let me read you a fairly lengthy passage. I'll only read two passages tonight, but let me read you one. From the most influential, internationally known American scientist, well, he came over from Switzerland, but we claim him, Louis Agassiz, who became a professor at Harvard College, at Harvard University. And his reputation in some circles is not so strong because he was the last major opponent of Darwin when he died. But listen to him in 1857. I am well aware that even the most eminent investigators consider the task of science at an end as soon as the most general relations of natural phenomena have been ascertained. To many, the inquiry into the primitive cause of their existence seems either beyond the reach of man or as belonging rather to philosophy rather than to physics. Two very separate. To these, the name of God appears out of place in a scientific work, as if the knowledge of secondary agencies constituted alone a worthy subject for their investigations, and as if nature could teach nothing about its author. So he's already reflecting on a change that was taking place just before the American Civil War, with colleagues saying none of this God talk. Now, I should tell you that when a former student of his was recruited from South Carolina to come up and said he wanted to join Agassiz, this was after the Civil War, in striking a blow for religion in the classroom, Agassiz said, "No way. I believe in God, but religion has no place in my classroom. We don't do that sort of thing in my classroom." So. Religion became what I somewhat confusingly call privatized among scientists. That is, it dropped out by about 1880. It's very hard to find any references. But most, at least American scientists, remain believers, Christians. They just kept their religious beliefs to their non-professional world. They would write pieces for their denominational papers. They would write books. They would write pamphlets. They would probably teach, I know some of the prominent ones taught Sunday school classes. But religion became something for the home and the church, and not for the classroom and the scientific journal. Science at the same time became depersonalized. Scientific writing from the late 19th and most of the 20th century is the most boring writing ever. And men of science, women of science used to write great prose. I mean, Darwin's Origin of Species is really a fine piece of English prose. But collectively, this new group of professionals started avoiding any reference to the first person, and they started using almost exclusively the passive voice. So you lose the whole sense of a human being being doing this work, because they wanted it to flow naturally from what they had discovered in the laboratory or out in the field. And in doing so, it becomes almost unreadable to anybody but a fellow specialist. Now, some other things happened with the arrival of science. We see a whole new category appearing in the 1840s, first applied to phrenology, the study of the skull and its shape. And this is the term pseudoscience. There, of course, was no pseudoscience before there was a category known as science. And it came along and was rapidly translated. As far as I can tell, it started out in the English world in the 1840s, and then pretty soon the Germans and Spanish and Russians and everybody had a translation of this pejorative term, pseudoscience. Few terms have proved to be as contentious as pseudoscience, because it is impossible to develop a set of criteria that will allow you to distinguish this legitimate science from this pseudoscience, because it so much depends on your own values. So everything you don't like is pseudoscience. And in the 20th century, the use of pseudoscience spread to be used by colleagues in the same discipline to criticize fellow specialists in the field, people who would never be associated with mesmerists or phrenologists in the 19th century, but they're fellow chemists with a different theory. Oh, that's pseudoscientific theory. And you dismiss it. Are there any social scientists here? Oh, this might be the time to leave. One of the big fights over the term pseudoscience was that many natural scientists in the late 19th and early 20th century insisted that this imitative science called social science was just the latest manifestation of pseudoscience. And I think what they worried about most of all, not only was it untrustworthy, but that as the government was providing more and more money for studying science, the physical and biological scientists didn't want to share. And there was a huge fight in the 50s when the National Science Foundation was created over whether it would legitimize and provide a trough for feeding the social scientists, which it did. And now charges of pseudoscience are only uttered in the hallways, I think, at universities. People don't talk about that. Another device that came up in this period, I've alluded to it, is the rhetorical slogan, scientific method. some talk about methods in the past, but nothing called the scientific method. One of my former students has gone through a number of sources of literature, scientific, and it appears in mid-19th century and then goes way up in frequency between the wars, tails off some. But this was a slogan invented largely, I think, by science educators to take to the classroom, to bring science in. And you probably, most of you are old enough, you probably had a science textbook that began with describing the scientific method. If you look at these textbooks, it's a little confusing because some of them have just 3 steps, and one I know has at least 11 steps. So I don't know which is the real scientific method. I'm pretty sure it's my colleague Steve Chapin who once joked that you have this guy who's familiar with the scientific method walk into a laboratory and he says, "Oh, and which step are you on now?" And he gets laughed out of the laboratory. Because, what does the scientific method reflect? What theoretical physicists do with pen and paper, or what some field biologists might do? And how does it differ from what historians do? Historians might ask. But historians never claim to be scientists. That's far beyond our skill. I forgot to ask you, David, how long was I supposed to take?
As long as you need.
Until they start walking out, huh?
We'll save some time for questions.
Good. So maybe 15 more minutes would be okay? Okay. Let me talk about an area of widespread misunderstanding, and that is the historical relationship between these ahistorical categories of science and religion. Although you found some Protestants trying to make hay out of the Galileo affair in the 17th century, it was always to put down the Catholic Church. It was not as though this reflected how science and religion were in opposition. Of course, they wouldn't have thought in those terms. And most people who wrote about these topics thought science and religion, or their synonyms, should be harmonious, and were harmonious. One of the early books to talk about it in America came out just about 1800, called that period An Age of Christian Science, and he wasn't talking about Mary Baker Eddy. But then challenges came from geology, which showed that life on Earth had been here for much longer than any typical biblical chronology would allow. That there was no scientific evidence of a Genesis flood. And had the impertinence also to try to suggest how Christians should read their Bibles to allow for the acceptance of their scientific views. And then you had a number of other challenges coming along during this period. Perhaps the most serious in the 40s and 50s was the theory that there had been plural human creations. Polygenism, it was called. And that meant that all humans weren't descendants of Adam and Eve from a single creation. And this became fairly popular among the growing community of skeptics. and Christians really opposed it, as I might add did African Americans. Late into the 19th century, when you would think that they might be critical of Darwinism, no, they're still hitting Pelagianism in their criticism of science, pseudoscience. I'm not sure which one it is. The notion of war or conflict between science and religion really broke into the open right after the end of the American Civil War, where in 1869, New York City, the rambunctious president, also a historian, of Cornell University gave a lecture that was heard around the world, not literally, but circulated very, very quickly, about the warfare between science and religion. And he had created in Ithaca, New York, where Cornell is located, an asylum for science where truth would not be stretched to accommodate some dogma of a religious group. What had happened is that during the Civil War, Congress had passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, giving land for science and technology, agriculture, to each state. And then they could sell their land and use it for buildings or whatever their needs were. Well, you can imagine there were fights in each state for this. And Cornell was just getting started. They went up against a lot of colleges run by religious denominations and won. And apparently, I have never found the evidence to substantiate this, but apparently some of these leaders of the Christian college had nasty things to say about Andrew Dixon White for pulling this off, for this asylum. And so he presented a history, a long history of the relationship between organized religion and scientific activity, portraying martyrs who sacrificed their lives, were tortured and imprisoned, and ending up, surprise, with a martyr from Ithaca. But there were enough people by then to generate some sympathy. He went on, he brought out another book in 1870, an extended, a little book of his lecture, and would publish new chapters in Popular Science Monthly, and then in 1896 published a doorstop, 2 volumes on this. By then he had decided he wasn't going to attack all of religion, but just dogmatic theology, Christianity. And then in 1874, one of the most skeptical of American scientists during the middle years of the 19th century, John William Dawson at New York University, wrote a book called The Conflict Between Science and Religion. Both of these authors, were translated into a dozen or 24 languages, were reprinted time and time. They're still in print as far as I know. And Dawson attacked primarily the Roman Catholic Church. There may have been some personal reasons for that. The doctrine of papal infallibility had just been announced recently, and so he really went after the Roman Catholic Church. So, let me deal with some of the examples that they raised that still circulate, much to the sadness of historians of science and religion who have been trying to beat these myths to death for at least 30 years, 40 years, maybe in some cases. So according to this notion of warfare or conflict, the early church, early Christian church, crushed ancient science and led to the Dark Ages. Well, there are two things wrong with that, as I understand you have a big medieval center here, there, as medievalists would want to point out. Two things. One is that when the Christians acquired enough power to have influence, they were the principal people who led to the survival of ancient knowledge, not the people who crushed it. Also, as some medievalists have pointed out, the Romans didn't leave much to crush. The Romans were great fighters, great administrators, very good with technology, and didn't give a damn about science by and large. So science had fallen to a very low spot by the time the Christians moved up in the 4th and 5th century. Another story both Draper and White and every other warfare theorist has talked about is that Christianity was responsible until Christopher Columbus' time of teaching that the earth was flat. And Columbus' sailors were scared to death that they were going to be sailing over the edge of the world and die. Every educated person in the world from antiquity, certainly from Aristotle on, knew that the earth was a sphere. This was a non-issue invented by the American novelist Washington Irving in the early 19th century when he wrote a biography of Columbus and wanted to spice up the story. There's one basis for this. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, there was an ultra-literalist group of still undetermined size, but two authors from that community did leave tracts favoring a flat earth. That's it that anybody so far has found, and trust me, I sound like Trump, don't I? Trust me. It's awesome what they've done. Nobody's found more than those. The old saw that the church prevented dissection during the Middle Ages is a complete misreading of the record. Another one that circulates, in fact, it continues to circulate in a number of astronomy textbooks down to the present, is that the Copernican revolution was opposed by religious people because it demoted humans from the center of the earth. Have you ever heard that story? Pure garbage. And the reason it's pure garbage is the center of the earth was the garbage pit of the universe. So, in case you don't know, Copernicus, in 16th century, Polish astronomer, argues that instead of the sun circling the earth is circling the sun and spinning on its axis at the same time. But nobody who was a contemporary of Copernicus's or Galileo's, who was probably his foremost advocate, used this argument because they knew that according to the Aristotelian Ptolemaic worldview, this was the sinkhole of the universe. The good part of the universe, of the cosmos, was out there where you had perfect motion and eternity and stuff. It wasn't until late in the 17th century when Newtonian physics replaced Aristotelian physics, the people said, oh boy, we gave up our privileged spot in the center of the universe. This happens to be a theory widely circulated by a certain Vienna psychiatrist named Sigmund Freud, who thought this was the first blow to the human psyche, and then Darwin came along, and then to just end everything was Sigmund himself. Almost all these stories talk about Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. The first real live martyr, no, dead martyr for science. Well, he was burned. And he did sort of believe in the Copernican theory, but that wasn't what got him in trouble at all. It was his terrible theological heresies about the divinity or non-divinity of Christ, and about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And he was the most unorthodox person you could imagine. It wasn't for whatever he thought about the cosmos, it was for what he thought about the Christ that got him incinerated. In fact, I have polled colleagues in the history of science for years to see if they could name one scientist who gave his or her life for science, and I haven't come up with a name yet. Well, I don't know. Okay, one more anecdote and then I'll quit. Galileo is the centerpiece of almost every account of warfare between science and religion. And you know, Galileo was hauled off to Rome in 1633 to face trial by the Inquisition, was thrown in jail, tortured, arrested, imprisoned for the rest of his life, right? Almost nothing about the traditional Galileo story is true. First of all, you need to know that although Galileo was one of the most brilliant scientists, he was a rotten human being. He had earlier befriended Pope Urban VIII, before he became Pope, who had been a supporter of his, and then when he wrote a book that he was told not to write, he put the Pope's arguments into the mouth of a character he called Simplicio. The Pope was not an idiot. This got right back to him, and he was not happy. So he lost the most powerful patron in the entire culture in which he lived. That is, Galileo lost this. And he thought he could afford to ignore a ban from the mid-teens not to promote the Copernican view. And one of the reasons he was so much in trouble, this was coming just on the heels of the Council of Trent, when the Catholic Church was trying to deal with those pesky Protestants, most notorious for trying to interpret the Scriptures. That was for the Catholic Church to do officially, not for individual Protestants. And what does Galileo try to do in 1610, 1611? He suggests how the Bible should be interpreted to accommodate the Copernican system. This was just what those darn Protestants were doing. And this was the worst time for him to have suggested this. Anyway, he gets hauled off to Rome. He goes down there. Doesn't get thrown into jail. He gets put up at the Tuscan embassy with his servant and stays there as an honored guest until the Inquisition calls him for the trial. Do they throw him in the Inquisition jail? No. the notary at the palace of the Inquisition gives up his 3-room apartment so that Galileo can live in comfort during the trial. Not only that, he didn't have to eat the rotten Inquisition food. I don't know if inquisitors ate rotten food, but his meals were catered from the Tuscan embassy. You know, the best Italian food you're going to get. He almost certainly was never tortured. A little known fact about Galileo is that shortly before this, he became a Catholic cleric himself and was even tonsured. Apparently he wanted some sort of retirement protection. But the Inquisition had rigorous rules against what you could do to a cleric, what you could do to an old man, and Galileo was an old man by now. He was a rather sickly old man by now. And there were rules against, say, putting somebody on the rack within X hours of eating. Now that was for self-protection, if you follow me. And historians, not I, have gone through and accounted for almost every hour he was there. It's virtually impossible that he was ever tortured. Now he may have had some psychological concerns during this period, but he was treated with respect by the Inquisition. Probably never walked out saying, "But still it moved," but that's a good line too. On the way home, he spent some time, he was sentenced to house arrest, but he spent some time, I think it was weeks long, as the guest of the bishop of, not Seville, one of the bishops in central Italy, and then went to spend the remainder of his life in his villa outside of Florence, consuming copious amounts of Sangiovese wine. If you ever want an excuse, you can always say, "This is a toast to Galileo," and order Sangiovese and stuff like that. 2 final facts, no anecdotes left. A few years back, one of the most prominent historians of science, John Heilbron, whom you met, wrote a book about the sun in the church. Now, Heilbron is not and has never been a Christian, okay? And he said for 600 years, from the 12th to the 18th century, no institution in Europe provided more support for astronomy than the Catholic Church. And the Galileo affair falls smack dab in the middle of that. And then Michael Schenck, who's also was one of our friends, a medievalist, has taken that claim one step further and said, for those 600 years, no institution provided greater support for the study of nature, period. Which is just a total reversal from what historians were saying just 150 years ago. So I hope you'll agree with me that the history of science is a wonderful story. And it's all true. Oh, I'm supposed to take questions, right? Okay, I'll take them. Okay.
As far as the scientific method is concerned, what about the writings of Sir Francis Bacon on reductionism back in the 1500s? That was always a landmark.
Oh yeah, people wrote about the methods that they endorsed, but there was nothing that established itself as the scientific method. Back in antiquity, people wrote about the methods for conducting science, but the scientific method as opposed to scientific methods, was sort of a mid-19th century construction. Somebody's hand up here? Yes?
I have two questions. I'll do one and then wait for everybody else on the other one. Can you talk about the faith of Euler?
No, I can barely pronounce it. No, I can't. Slippery, probably. What's your second question? Maybe I can hit.
Actually, I was referring to the scientist Euler.
I know you were.
And then my second one,
Do you know about his faith?
a little bit.
What was he?
He was a Christian, and he actually had.
Was he a real Christian or a Catholic?
He had several debates with, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, with, I guess you would call it the Salon of France. I don't know if it was Voltaire in person, but it was definitely a school in Paris that had these same ideas. And he vigorously defended his Christian faith against their philosophical arguments.
I mean, one of the most overblown episodes in intellectual history is the Enlightenment. I mean, I've tried to do this for the United States, count people who would be included. Yeah, they were fairly influential, but just think, during the 18th century, you had the rise of Pietism in Germany, of Wesleyanism in England, the Great Awakening in the colonies here. It was a time of great religious enthusiasm. And the Enlightenment was numerically self-contained, fairly contained, is what I mean. Yeah.
My second question kind of goes back, and as you said, the term science wasn't invented yet or something.
Given its current meaning.
Right. But what about Luther's argument and criticism of, I guess what we would call classical education, Aristotle and Plato, and his disputes with teaching via Plato and Aristotle?
Well, what I can say is that the Lutheran colleges in the 17th century became the most prominent vehicles for disseminating Copernicanism. And despite what Luther may have said in one of his table talks about this guy is trying to turn everything upside down, the Lutherans were more receptive. Again, we typically get a distorted view when we look at 16th century history of science. And of course, prominent in that story is the Copernican revolution. 60 years after the publication of his book, Copernicus' book, there were definitely 10 disciples and maybe 11 or 12. It hardly made a dent in the consciousness of people in Europe. It wasn't until the 17th century that this becomes a really talked about, influential idea. Yes, David.
I'm fascinated by your initial thesis regarding the technical terms science and scientists and how they're modern origin. And I wonder, even during your own talk, you referred to Galileo as a scientist.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, which suggests to me that, in fact, what we need is perhaps a sort of evolutionary understanding of what science is, one that has changed over time. Its relation with religion, particular religions, has changed over time. So, for instance, I personally am comfortable saying there are some things about what Aristotle did that were scientific, even if he would never have recognized what science was or what the term science meant, even if he did it in a degree. So I I'm inclined to think that from the standpoint of modern historians, who after all have to understand the past with reference to our own conceptual framework, it seems to me incredibly useful to use this word scientist to describe events and people in the past, even if they didn't self-acknowledge that, and even if, in point of fact, we've got to be very careful about what precisely we mean by science depending upon the time period.
Well, I hear your point. Historians have become very skeptical, and people in other disciplines too, about any essentialist understanding. And I started out looking at this by saying, okay, when the label changed from natural philosophy to science, did anything happen? Well, yeah, it did. Some fairly important things took place with that. And science took on a meaning that it hadn't had in the past. And so historians generally like to use the vocabulary of the historical actors as much as they can. Now you have to translate some, etc. Rather than taking a 19th or 20th century category and saying, Aristotle didn't know it, but he was a scientist. That goes against the grain of most historians.
But nevertheless, in trying to understand the roots of modern science, it's sometimes helpful to talk in those terms.
Oh, I can understand. One of my best friends, he died earlier this year, David Lindbergh, wrote The Beginnings of Western Science. And he sold tens of thousands of copies of that. And I used to give him a hard time because I said, this is totally misleading. You know there was no science, and you didn't say the beginnings of Western natural philosophy just to increase your sales, because nobody would buy Western natural philosophy. And he would sputter back at me, yes. You, and then you. Blue shirt.
In your research, have you ever found a point where you would say science and religion peacefully coexisted, or do you think they would be able to do that in the future?
Well, I can tell you there was a period in the early 19th century when the prevailing view was peaceful coexistence, maybe even mutual support. I'm not seeing it in the future. Scientists have become increasingly secular. The percentage in a study done by a sociologist, Elaine Eklund, a few years back, she studied 1,600 scientists at 20 major universities, so no small colleges or anything. And just under 2/3 were self-described atheists or agnostics. When in the general public, you're going to get single digits. The real kicker for me was of the atheists/agnostics, more than 20% self-described as spiritual. What does that mean? Well, she followed it up. She's a good sociologist and followed it up. And it can mean anything they want it to mean. You know, you walk out in a rainstorm and it feels wonderful and you say, I feel spiritually uplifted. Or you climb a mountain and that happens to you or something. So it just has a huge range of meanings. For my daughter, who considers herself spiritual but not religious, it means she doesn't want anything to do with organized religion. So you have to kind of follow it up. But that doesn't bode well for the future, does it? Those statistics. Okay, one back here.
Going back before, after the Romans, you had what's now labeled as alchemy. And where does that fit in with this whole range of issues that you've been discussing?
I'm so glad you asked that. Are you a chemist?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a wonderful essay in this book that's for sale by Larry Principe on alchemy and astrology and how they've been demonized, but they shouldn't be. I mean, alchemy was the father of chemistry, and a lot of the early chemists were playing with alchemy, and our understanding of alchemy in the Renaissance period is, according to him, and he's an authority on it, is very mistaken. So if you want to practice alchemy, go ahead. This guy and then these two.
Just a question about the rise of methodological naturalism in the 19th century. I'm kind of curious, what were some of the factors or causes that led to that?
Well, there are a number. One was that repeatedly attributing something in nature to God didn't seem to be making any progress. And progress was being made in a number of scientists during the first half of the 19th century. In fact, when Darwin came along, one of the most outstanding holes was with the origin of species, which was still fairly widely attributed to divine creation. And so some people even said about Darwin, the best thing he has going for him is that there's nothing else worthy of the name of science to take its place. So there was that sense of momentum. It also brought a sense of community. That is, if you adopted methodological naturalism, you could be an atheist, there weren't many. You could be a Protestant, you could be a Catholic, you could be Eastern Orthodox, and do science. You know, when you walked into the lab or went out into the field, it didn't make any difference. You weren't going to put it in as an argument in your field. And it wasn't skeptics, atheists, agnostics who had been pushing for this. It was mostly Christian scientists, which seems counterintuitive in retrospect, but that's what happened. Your leading, almost all the scientists were leading scientists back then were Christians, so they pushed for this. And it was so appealing that even in the 20th century, fundamentalist scientists embraced that. It wasn't until the intelligent design people came along and challenged it in the 1990s and said, I think logically incorrectly, that methodological naturalism was the moral equivalent of ontological naturalism. I don't see that, but that's the point they've been making. Okay, you two?
Yes, just in relation to his question about if science and religion ever coexisted, I mean, one of the best examples in the history of the world was 800 to 1100 Baghdad. Islam gave us algebra, and the best mathematicians in the world were in Baghdad.
And maybe even alchemy.
Yeah, and 75% of the stars in the night sky had Arabic names. It all comes from that time period. There was no conflict between Islam and science.
And what years did you?
800 to 1100. It was the golden age of Baghdad.
Yeah, you know that there's been a huge reappraisal because for years people said it all came to a screeching end about 1100.
Yeah.
But it didn't. I mean, in medicine and in astronomy, it continued to prosper probably up until about the 15th century.
So that's what you've heard of as the golden age.
Right, right. Most historians don't believe in golden ages or fathers of.
Since your talk was like that intersection between religion and science, I've always been interested with the doctrine of signatures where you
Yes.
sort of see a plant and you say, it looks like a body part, so it must be good to see. Where is the origin of that? Was that a religious sect that was looking at plants and putting religious things on them?
It was part of
What time period are we talking about?
what? It goes back to antiquity, I'm pretty sure, and goes up to the 19th century, or certainly the 18th century. But the idea was, well, two ideas. One is that God would provide what you needed when you moved around the world. So you move into the new world here, and so you look for things that seem related and see if they're not efficacious. It was rooted in this idea of natural theology, not miraculous, but that in the great divine plan, God had provided these things, and to help us identify what we might need, made the appearance similar. I wonder if anybody's done an empirical study of that.
Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're...
Oh yeah, that's why I'm wondering, what's the most striking case of something?
Mandrake is one, and the other one I think is hepatica.
What do I take mandrake for?
I think they just thought it was all body tonic.
Tonic, oh.
That was also probably...
Like Sangiovese wine?
Tonic, they called everything tonic.
Yes.
This gentleman kind of brought up something I was wanting to talk about like the golden age of Islam.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about cross-cultural things about how religion and scientific practices might have operated, say in China or Japan or Korea or something, in contrast to, let's say, medieval Europe?
In fact, I do. In the introduction, you would not remember this, but that I co-edited a book called Science and Religion Around the World a few years ago with John Brooke. And we were concerned that although we talked, in fact, he had a book called Science and Religion, a very good book. It was only about science and Christianity. So we organized an international group to write papers on the three Abrahamic traditions, which fairly well known, but could stand a little. The Islamic story needed some fleshing out for sure. Jewish story too. Then the literate traditions of East and South Asia, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. We should, but we didn't find anybody to do Native American. Well, it's a morass if you're trying to pull out any generalizations. Sub-Saharan African people had no language remotely similar. The Chinese didn't have a word for science until, what is it, like the 19th century or something like that, despite the Jesuit astronomers being over there early. There's just not much until the modern period when science, although it's a local phenomenon in many ways, has traveled immensely well into every region of the world, every ethnicity. It is amazing. And so that has raised some parallel issues there. And just earlier this week, I was a referee for a grant application of two bright young scholars, one an East Asian and the other an American, who are trying to get grants to write a jointly authored study of this very phenomenon. And it's not going to be easy.
I'm going to ask a little oddball question, so my apology firsthand is that my background is the pseudoscience of linguistics, and I learned it while an inmate at the Cornell Assembly. And that's this, you didn't say anything about the metaphorization of scientific terms and the fact that they have become one of the commanding metaphors of the way we talk in intellectual circles. So that the relationship of the way we talk and the actual meaning of the term when you're writing about science may have a great distance between them. But they're there, and they have the role that one time theological images had in terms of being dominant metaphors.
Yeah. I actually know more about 19th century culture than 21st century culture. I spend more time living there than I do in the 21st century.
Well, the 20th century was replete with this in many ways. You know,
I don't know that too well.
intellectual discussions, biology terms became highly metaphorical. And, you know,
Oh, yeah.
we have a million meanings for evolution.
Right.
Contradictory.
Sometimes they were, you bet. Yeah. That makes it challenging for historians, but fun too. Thought I saw movement somewhere around here. Or is that just wishful? Oh, there it is. Two of them, my.
So, I have a question. Given the religious practitioners, particularly fundamentalist Christians, but not limited to them, where that direction is going, and where materialistic scientific discourse is going, do you think the continued divergence between them is more on the part of the scientists doing, or of the religious practitioners doing, or a little of both?
A lot of both. They don't like each other or respect each other very much at all. And you probably know, a few years ago, Answers in Genesis built this $27 million state-of-the-art museum, and this summer they opened a $150 million Ark Encounter. And just this past week, I found out that the Canadians in Saskatchewan are going to equal it. They're going to build their own life-size Ark, so that they... One of the other phenomena I didn't get to talk about, and you don't want me to talk about it, is, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is globalism. And, you know, it used to be anti-evolution creationism was a distinctive American thing. It's all over the world now. Yes?
Returning to your answer to his question, and you had quoted us, or referenced a study of 22% of academic scientists. Are there any...
22% of the combined 63% of atheists and agnostics were believed in spirituality of some kind.
My question is, has there ever been a study of the non-academic scientists, of the practicing doctors, the practicing engineers, the scientists who are not in the ivory tower?
Lots of claims, lots of speculation, but I don't know of any reliable study. You have the general American population that would pick up some of those. You have a multi-million-dollar study going on now of survey, sociology, of beliefs in, I think, 6 different countries that might pick up some. There's a pretty good study of Islamic medical students and physicians and their beliefs about evolution. That I think goes, it's not elitist as far as I know. And that's, by definition, if you're a medical student or a physician, you're a part of the elite. I have friends who would tell me they are. What? No.